Hello and welcome. Why is rape still being used as a weapon of war in the Democratic Republic of Congo in spite of peace deals between the government and militia groups? Africa's deadliest conflict has cost an estimated 5 million lives, and violent abuse continues to be used as a weapon to intimidate, punish and control. The DRC's military court found a commanding officer and 8 of his men guilty of committing numerous rapes in a town earlier this year, a decision marking the first time any high-ranking commander has been held accountable for such crimes. And while many in the international community praise the ruling as a milestone, it has done little to comfort the large number of women dealing with the trauma of sexual violence. Today we ask what can be done to provide real protection against rape crimes in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Send an SMS or an email to the show. Well, I'm joined by 2 guests who are very familiar with the horrors of war in the DRC. Joining me from Paris is Eve Ensler, world-renowned feminist and activist. Her organization has recently co-developed City of Joy, a shelter for sexually battered women in the DRC. And from Oslo, Norway, we have Marcus Bleasdale, an award-winning photojournalist who has spent over 8 years covering the DRC conflict. It's a pleasure to have you both on the show. And Eve, I have to start with you. It's great to get you back on the show. And it's sad, though, that a couple of years on, we're still talking about this subject. We talked before when you were launching your campaign, Stop Raping Our Greatest Resource, Power to Women in the DRC. And it seems things certainly haven't improved since then. They're worse, if anything. Why?
Well, I think the basic fundamentals haven't changed very much. We still have many outside militias, whether they're from Burundi or Rwanda or Uganda, waging war, fighting a war inside the Congo on the bodies of the Congolese, particularly the bodies of the women of Congo. And I think that basic problem, that basic structure, that basic exploitation of minerals that continues, and where militias are used to control the mines and exploit the minerals, that hasn't changed. But I'm a little more optimistic than I was before, and maybe that's because I just came from the opening of City of Joy, which is an extraordinary place, opened by V-Day with the Pansy Foundation and support from UNICEF in Bukavu. And the opening was a very, very exhilarating and positive moment after many years of horror and atrocities. And I have great faith in the women of Congo. I have great faith in the women. And I am seeing, after years now of working and struggling in movements inside the Congo and outside the Congo, women in the diaspora and women inside the Congo, women activist leaders, have really been building a movement that is really taking shape and taking form. And I think women are finally coming into their power and voice.
But Eve, let me ask you what you make of that recent conviction of that high-ranking commander and 8 of his men for crimes of rape. And I wonder what real impact you think it might have there.
Well, I think the fact that anyone's been arrested and anyone's held accountable is a good thing. Seeing how many people have been raped, what we're up to, an estimated 500,000 women have been raped in the Congo. So of course it's good. The question is, what will happen to this person? Will he be kept in prison, which is a huge question, because we don't see people often staying in prison. And if he is kept in prison, what will the consequences be? And how will that be exposed? And how will that affect other people? I mean, I think those are all huge questions. But I think anybody being arrested at this point, or any end to any minutia of impunity, is an excellent thing.
Right. Marcus Bleasdale, you've won numerous awards for your work around the world, and I know you've spent about 8 years working in the DRC and have seen up front the horrors taking place there. What do you think is different about the way this particular conflict is being conducted?
Well, I think there are several reasons why this particular conflict is enduring in the way that it has. Is that most of the conflict is happening in regions that are inaccessible. There's an international kind of lethargy in the way that they have been dealing with the problem, and the overall pressure on the Congolese government to have any effective control over their troops in the areas where the conflict is manifesting itself is also a major problem. So there are many factors that make this conflict endure in the way that it has.
Well, let me ask you to answer an email question we got here, Marcus, that came in from a viewer by the name of Kasi Chipoka, who suggests a course of action. Kasi writes in saying, the world needs to know what's happening in the DRC and give the plight of women priority. Intervention is the only solution here. I mean, from what you see, who could intervene effectively? What mandate could they have?
I think it's a little bit more complicated than intervention. We have already UN troops on the ground. In some cases they are effective, in some cases they're drastically ineffective. And that has been a major problem in the past, in that the areas, even where the UN troops are controlling, they haven't really been as effective as they could have been. They haven't been in areas where, or they haven't been as probing as they should be. I was in DRC just last month, in the northeastern part, actually, in an area where the Lord's Resistance Army are very, very active, abducting children, abducting women, raping women for many, many months, many years. And the UN are patrolling the main streets of small villages, but not moving away from those main streets where the LRA are active and where most of the civilians are living. And so it's a huge problem that it's more the ineffectiveness of the international community. Intervention is not really an answer. International intervention is not really an answer here. The place is vast. The country is huge, and it's more diplomacy, it's more pressure, it's more pressure from international governments in terms of funding, because half the problem here is government-led. Remember that most of these, well, not most, but a lot of these places, the rapes are being committed by government soldiers. These are government soldiers that the international community is funding via the government of Kinshasa. So we have to understand that it's the international community that, in a way, has a responsibility to make sure that the Congolese troops are behaving in a way that is acceptable to the international conventions of conflict.
Now, Eve Ensler, getting back to you, I know your passion for taking action has come from your own personal abuse through your life, and you're very passionate about making sure that this is highlighted and dealt with. I wonder to what degree your own experiences have helped these women that you deal with at the City of Joy to open up, because of course it's such a stigma what they've been through in that society, and I wonder how much it helps in terms of how you can get to relate to them and get them to open up about their experiences.
Well, my experience with Congolese women from the last 4 years, and I think one of the reasons Vide made a decision to stay and commit so much of our energy and resources to supporting the women in the Congo, is that they're incredibly strong, incredibly resilient, and quite brilliant women. And I think I've been very lucky in many ways to be in a very deep relationship with quite a few women in the Congo. And I think obviously being a survivor of rape gives me a level of connection and compassion. But what I will say is that I think the women of Congo are ready, truly ready, to make change. And I think with small resources and huge resources at their backs, the women of Congo can indeed turn the Congo around. And a lot of things that Marcus was talking about, like the failure of the UN, I just a couple of weeks ago, I believe, there were 2 South Africans who were held hostage in the Congo, and they were released this week. And it turned out that the UN people knew exactly where to go to find the militias that released the South Africans. So a question was posed at a recent press conference, well, if you knew where the militias were to release the hostages, why weren't you going and arresting the militias themselves? And I think part of it is an ennui, part of it is a lack of intention and a lack of will on the international community's part. Part of it is there's a kind of growing acceptability that this is what happens in the Congo, so we'll just let it continue to happen. But I do think that if people begin to invest in the women and put faith in the women and put stock in the women, the City of Joy will be exactly that, a place where women turn their pain to power and become leaders. I think as women move into leadership positions, we will see a radical shift in the politics of the Congo.
Marcus, you've obviously documented some of the terrible things that have been happening. I think one of the sets of pictures you had involved the abductions and forced rape and marriage that were being committed by the Lord's Resistance Army. Explain to me the kind of things you witnessed. I just came back actually just last month from spending 3 months covering this issue in the Democratic Republic of Congo and also Central African Republic and Uganda. And Joseph Kony, who's been operating the region for over 20 years, has been abducting children, abducting young boys and forcing them to be child soldiers, and also abducting young women, 13, 14-year-old women, and giving them as trophies to his commanders. If they perform well in battle, they get a wife. If they perform well and are loyal to him, they get a wife. And so many of the commanders have several wives. And I interviewed hundreds of children, many of them young girls who had been forced into being the wife of Joseph Kony or one of his commanders. They had to endure years in the bush. They had to endure forced rape on a daily basis. Many of them gave birth to children. And luckily, the ones that I managed to interview had escaped. And they escaped with children under their arms, sometimes
2 children, 3 children under their arm as they fled through the bush away from Joseph Kony. So whilst we hear quite a lot about what's going on in eastern Congo, which is extraordinarily good to hear all of this news, what we mustn't forget is what's going on in the forgotten areas of northeastern Congo and what Joseph Kony is doing to the thousands of children that he's abducting every year.
And I wonder, you know, when it comes to actually taking some kind of action against the perpetrators, I'd mentioned to Eve earlier about or talked to her about the conviction of that commander and 8 of his men. What have you seen in terms of a process to try to get to the perpetrators and stop this happening?
Well, it really does depend on where you look. I've been in Bunia, a town which saw horrific atrocities in 2002, 2003 to 2004. And I've been in civil courts there where local population have been held accountable for their actions with, you know, violence against women. I've seen people put in jail because of acts that they have committed against women in the region. But I've also seen men released just a few months later to go to their families with the payment of a contribution to the family of a goat or a few chickens, which invariably doesn't end up with the woman who was the center of the violence. I've also seen military courts there where Congolese soldiers have been brought up against military tribunals and found guilty, but then 3 weeks later they're wandering around in the town with a gun and sitting in the bars again, very close to the areas where the women who they violated just a few weeks earlier are living. And so it really does depend on where you're looking. As I said earlier on, I'd just come back from the northeastern part of Congo where Joseph Kony is very active and Joseph Kony's men are very active, where the situation is very different. It's a question of abduction, and very young girls, 13, 14 years old, are being abducted by Joseph Kony and being forced into marriage to his commanders as a trophy in a way, a trophy of war. And these women spend many years as wives to the commanders and raped continuously, and many of them are forced to then bear children, and those children that they then have to live with, and many of them have actually fled with their children under their arm after several years being forced into these kind of bush camps of Joseph Kony. Horrific.
Now Eve, earlier on, Marcus had mentioned about how the DRC conflict is so different because of how remote some of those areas are, and I know it's really difficult for a lot of the women because they can't get access to medical care in those areas. They still have to work in many cases to support their families. And I want to ask you to address 2 emails. I'm going to read them back to back. They touch on a similar theme. The first one is from Wesley Tiku, who wrote in saying, "If the government in Kinshasa cannot protect its people, why not empower local communities with the resources to protect themselves?" And the other one from the Netherlands, from Getahun Mosisa, says, "There should be a system that specifically works on the socio-economic and political empowerment of women. This way women can assert their rights and defend themselves." How do you regard that idea of local empowerment to give people a chance to survive out there in the rural areas?
Well, I think it's the only solution, and I think part of what City of Joy is doing and modeling, hopefully, and hopefully we'll get to build many City of Joys in the Congo, but the whole basis of City of Joy is bringing 90 women for 6 months and training them in their legal rights, in becoming spokespeople, learning what the justice system is about, healing from their trauma. There'll be agricultural programs, there'll be internet programs, and the whole idea then is that they then, after 6 months, go back to their communities and they share what they've learned. There'll be self-defense, there'll be all kinds of programs where women learn that they have the right to defend themselves, to stand up for themselves, to prosecute their cases, to go to trial, and to gather other women to be behind them when they do go to trials. And I think if we can really begin to create leaders and women who then empower their communities, we can begin to spread this empowerment on the local level and in the really remote villages where women don't have access to medication, don't have access to hospitals, don't have access to schools, and don't have access to protection. And I think with local leadership building, then women will begin to become leaders in their own community and make demands for those kind of local protection systems. I think it is the only way. And I think there's a difference between sending in arms, which I don't think will be a solution. And believe me, it's occurred to me from time to time when I see the kind of atrocities and massacres that are committed against women, when I see women now who I've known over 4 years and they've been raped not once, but twice. And this time I met a woman who was the third time raped after she'd been operated on 7 times and sent home and then come back. I don't think arms are the solution, but I do think empowering women to know their rights and then having women become local leaders who then fight for the kind of protection that women are entitled to is the solution.
And Eve, on that thought, an email, if I may follow up with, from Uganda, from Ian Uela, who wrote in saying, rape is a very manipulative weapon of war in Congo. Victims often remain quiet because they fear cultural stigma. This is something we touched on earlier. How are you finding that at the City of Joy, getting women to be able to feel confident and secure enough to be able to speak out?
Well, over the last 3 years, we did quite a few events called Breaking the Silence, where women who had been survivors of terrible sexual violence came forward in Goma, in Bunia, in Kinshasa, in Bukavu, and broke the silence. And by that I mean they stood up and they told their stories to hundreds of people publicly. And I think what that has done, and with a lot of other efforts of a lot of other groups, has begun to create a climate where women are saying the shame is not on me. The shame is on my perpetrator. And I think the more we can create worlds and create systems where women tell their stories and do not feel the shame and the guilt and the horror is something they've done, but is something that their perpetrators are responsible, the more we're going to shift. I think the hardest thing in the Congo is for women to break the silence and to go against tradition, because when a woman has been raped, often she is exiled, she is considered no longer part of a community, she is turned on by members of her family. And I think there is a growing V-Men movement, I'm really happy to say, where at least 200 men were at the opening who consider themselves V-Men, men who are standing up to stop the violence against women and girls in the Congo, and who understand that the life of women is seriously connected to the continuing of all life in the Congo. And I think more and more men are becoming activists, and more men are fighting for women's rights and for women to be protected and cherished and safe and empowered.
Now, Marcus, to expand the conversation a bit, the DRC has incredible mineral wealth. I mean, huge amount of mineral wealth, and it seems that's more of a curse than a blessing. And I wonder if you could just give us a basic idea on how that battle for the resources of Congo underpins what's going on.
Well, essentially, it's us as a consumer nation that have the minerals that we find in DRC, the cassiterite, the gold. None of these are actually consumed in DRC. They're all consumed by the West. They're all consumed in our mobile phones. The tin that is found in DRC is consumed in our computers. It's used as solder. A large percentage of the tin that is found in DRC goes into the world's solder manufacturing companies, which ends up in your computers and your phones. And so we actually have a responsibility as consumers to understand where our minerals are coming from, to understand that our consumerism is directly affecting the conflict in DRC, and that conflict then creates a system and a level of insecurity in the region, which allows these soldiers, these militias, and the government soldiers to act with impunity. If there's no effective court, if there's no effective civil prosecution in the region, then men feel that it's almost their right that they can go off and take these women and force themselves on these women in this way. And what we have to do, I think, is understand firstly that this war has to stop. International community, if they want this war to stop, if they had the motivation to make this war to stop, they could do it. Nkunda fought for over 10 years in DRC. This is General Nkunda, was fought for over 10 years in DRC, but when it didn't suit the Rwandan government anymore to have him there, he was immediately arrested. This can happen, again, with many other of the warlords that are working out there, and it can happen also with pressure being put on the Congolese government to make sure that their soldiers are hauled in and also educated. The whole problem here as well is that the men, many of the soldiers, feel this is their right, and they have to be told that it is not.
Now,
they have to be told that this is there can be change and there has to be change.
Now, presumably, there hasn't been much impact then from President Kabila's effort to ban mining in certain areas, to limit the mining in certain areas such as the east of the country. Marcus.
Limiting mining. Yeah, limiting mining in areas such as Eastern Congo, whilst I think internationally it draws attention to the problem, I don't think it is a solution. I think if you limit legitimate mining in a country, it only draws in illegitimate mining. Kabila saying that there is no mining allowed in eastern Congo doesn't necessarily mean that his soldiers themselves are not continuing, and that's what's happening. It's that the militia are pushed out and the local population are pushed out, but his Congolese government soldiers are still mining.
Now, Eve, just getting back to something you'd said about the inclusion of V-men now, the fact that men are actually realizing how much they are part of the solution as well as part of the problem is interesting, because I know that one of the key issues in the DRC is that many of the rapes are committed as gang rapes, and often that's seen as a rite of passage for men. They bond through it, and whereas the women are left totally ostracized. And I wonder, again, when dealing with that kind of situation, how you're able to at least make men be part of the vehicle for the solution, get them to spread the word about what harm is being done.
Well, I've been very impressed and actually very moved by the men who I was working with this last trip and the last 2 trips in Bukavu. And I think a lot of them have been inspired by Dr. Mukwege, who is the director of Panzi Hospital and who has been on the front lines of this war for the last 12 years, literally sewing up women as fast as the militias are ripping them apart. And he's really the godfather of the V-Men movement. And it was very fascinating this last trip because there were a lot of young doctors and a lot of young professional men in Bukavu who had really taken up the cause of V-Men. And I sat in on a few of their meetings, and I was just listening to what they were saying. And, you know, the Congolese army, it's in a weird phrase, because what is it? Is there really such a thing as a Congolese army? It's a molding of warlords from other armies put into, and other countries melted into one army that isn't really a Congolese army. And I think there are many men in Congo who don't feel that the army represents them and that the violence represents them, and they have a very different sensibility. And I think the question is, how do men organize those men and bring those men forward? You'll find a lot of them in the universities, a lot of them are younger men, a lot of them are men who are just simply outside that system. And I was able to just sit and listen to men talking about the shame they feel, the horror they feel about what has been done to their sisters and their mothers and their girlfriends and their wives, and the lack of control, and how it's dehumanized them, and how it's made them feel less men, and how it's made them feel that they've lost any rights to their country, as well as to connecting to the women of their country. And I think as this movement grows and galvanizes, there is real hope for the future of the Congo, because I think as men begin to see that they are in great partnership and solidarity with the women who are being raped, and that no woman rapes herself. You know, 95% of the women, of violence that happens towards women in the world, unfortunately, is done by men. And I think when men really begin to see violence against women as their problem, and they're committed to it as deeply as women are to stopping it, I really believe things will change in the Congo.
And of course, Marcus, one of the key things I think as you document what's happening in the Congo is that many people don't realize it's the women that do a lot of the work. They're such a major part of the workforce, with many of the men being involved in militia and in the military in general. It's the women who actually take up a lot of the workload burden, isn't it?
It's not. The women take up about 90% of the workload, and they are about 90% of the economy in DRC. It's the women that give birth to the children. It's the women that collect the water. It's the women that do the cooking. It's the women that educate. The women that care. It's the women that provide the glue to society. And this is what's so terrible about this use of rape as a war crime, of sexual violence in conflict, is that it destroys that society, it destroys that structure, it rips away the glue from the villages, and these women that currently bind the villages together, that currently allow a village to be economically viable, it rips them apart because they're thrown out of their homes and they're thrown out of the villages because of the rape. And so this is why, unfortunately, it is such an effective tool. It is such an effective weapon of war, is because it rips apart whole communities. And
right. Sorry, the reason I'm stopping you, Marcus, is that... Hey, Eve, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
Not only are women the primary breadwinners, but women are incredibly exploited in terms of labor. And you will often see a woman carrying 100 pounds, 200 pounds sacks on their backs. And I think the real struggle right now is to get women to understand that they have the power, they just need to take the power. You know, they are actually making the country work, and yet at the same time, their money is taken away from them by their husbands. They are exploited like hell. I mean, I would virtually say it's slave labor in most cases, if you look at the kind of labor that women are doing. And if women really begin to know their rights and begin to know what they're entitled to, then they will actually take the power because they actually have the power to be taken. So I think that's really an important point.
Well, Eve Ensler and Marcus Bleasdale, thank you very much for discussing this. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Riz.
Remember, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, Tear Down This Wall. The man who wrote the immortal album The Wall more than 30 years ago is urging Israel to take down its separation barrier in the West Bank. Roger Waters reveals the passion behind his project for peace. Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.